Thank you for joining us today. We'll begin in a few moments. For those of you just joining us, we'll begin in a moment. Welcome. My name is Piper Chapman, and I'm the Assistant Director at Harvard Alumni Travels. Thank you for joining us today for our travel talk, Vienna in 1824, the premiere of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, presented by Professor Thomas Forrest Kelly. Before I turn things over to Professor Kelly, I'd like to review the format for today's Zoom webinar. For the duration of the lecture, your video and microphone will be turned off so we can direct our attention to our speaker. On the bottom of your screen, you will see several buttons to interact with. Please insert your questions for Professor Kelly in the Q&A box. You will also see a chat box, which is intended for comments, sharing information, and to engage with fellow alumni. To chat the entire audience, please select all panelists and attendees when submitting your comment. For those of you who would like to hide this chat feature, you may do so by moving the chat to the side of your screen. Closed captioning is available, and you will find it by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Should you have any technical issues, please message our support team by selecting HAA support in the chat. Alternatively, this lecture is live streamed to YouTube, so if you wish to join us there, please find the YouTube link in the chat. Today's 1-hour webinar will be recorded. In our post-lecture follow-up, you will receive an email, including the recording and other resources to enjoy. Finally, we appreciate your patience should we experience technological glitches or delays due to the nature of our virtual environment. This presentation will contain beautiful pieces of music, and while our volume will remain slightly lower, please note that you can adjust your sound preferences on your personal device. In the spirit of travel, I'd like to kick things off by encouraging you to share your location in the chat box. Let's take a look where everyone's tuning in from. Oh my goodness, we have well over 1,000 people joining us from all over the world. It's amazing. I am thrilled to pass this over to Tom Kelly, the Morton B. Knopfel Professor, Research Professor of Music at Harvard University and former chair of the music department. Tom's main fields of interest include medieval music and chant and performance practice. He has published many books and articles on related subjects. He is a seasoned study leader for the Harvard Travel Program, having lectured on several trips in Europe. Tom instructs a wildly popular Harvard X online course, First Nights, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, and the 19th Century Orchestra. So for those of you who are craving more content after this lecture, I encourage you to check it out. Tom, we are so fortunate and excited to have you with us today. So without further ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Piper, and hello, everybody. It's very nice to have everybody here, and I'm glad to have an opportunity to talk to you about what I guess might be the world's most famous piece of classical music. You probably know that musical institutions all around the world are celebrating Beethoven's 250th birthday. It actually doesn't come up until December of this year, but everybody is doing that. It's also worth noting maybe that we are pretty close to being able to celebrate the 150th birthday of the first performance of this great piece. Now I'm gonna try to show you a couple of pictures here and see what happens. What I hope is that you now see a picture of Beethoven. And if you don't, I'm sure the people from Harvard Travel will let me know. But this is Beethoven, the great monument. This is Beethoven up on the pedestal. This is the man who wrote the famous symphony that has the famous tune. Everybody knows this tune, right? It's become a Protestant hymn. I've heard it used to advertise Fords, more new wagons, more new wagons. There are all sorts of things. The melody in the last movement is now also officially the anthem of the European community. And you may know that, at least according to legend, the modern CD, compact disc, it's not so modern anymore, but that when the Sony company and the Philips company were deciding together how big this new optical disc should be, the Japanese, for whom the Ninth Symphony is an iconic piece and it gets performed just about in every town in Japan as a New Year's event, the Sony people said, it can be any size you want as long as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony fits on one side of it. And that, so they say, is why the CD is the size it is. So we think of it as a great titanic, timeless piece of music. And in a way it is. We all know that it's the piece that has the tune in it. Well, here's the tune, just to remind everybody. This is a place after the singers have sung and the orchestra's played and all the variations on the tune stop and some other music happens, and then Beethoven sort of stops everything. You know that something's happening, but he has this wonderful way of holding back and saying, wait for it. Here's that place. That tune, you know that tune. Well, we think of it as a timeless masterwork, and it is. But it also was a brand new piece of contemporary music in Vienna in 1824. And if we think of it from the point of view of the people who did or didn't go to hear that first performance, we learn a lot of things about the differences between ourselves and them, between what music meant to people then and what music means to us now, and so forth. One of the things that Beethoven's audience knew that we don't, maybe, is that song that they were singing is in a way a drinking song. You probably know that Beethoven took the text from a song by a poem by Germany's second most famous poet, Mr. Schiller, and it's Schiller's Ode to Joy. And it's written as though it were a drinking song. Beethoven didn't take the parts that sound like drinking, but it's really written as though it were the lyrics to a song sung by a gentleman's society, sitting around a table, guzzling wine or beer and singing about the ladies, and enjoying the good fellowship that the poem is actually about. And in fact, we have an institution in Harvard University called the Harvard Glee Club that was founded a little bit later than the Ninth Symphony to do a similar kind of thing, gentlemen getting together and singing songs called glees. There's an outfit in Boston called the Handel and Haydn Society, founded in 1815, who commissioned music from Beethoven, founded for the same purpose. And there was in London a group called specifically the Glee Club, who sang these songs called glees, and it was gentlemen who got together and drank and sang about ladies. You think you've gone to the wrong lecture, but you haven't. This actually is relevant. One of the interesting things is that Beethoven knew that about Schiller's Ode. And the gentlemen of the Glee Club in London had as their sort of theme song, a song they always sang, the Anacreontic Song. This is a song that they imagine they're singing to the great god of drinking and poetry, the mythical Anacreon from the Middle East. And they beg him to be their patron. And he says, sure, I'll teach you. And I'll teach you to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine. The myrtle of Venus, that is the beauty of women, with the Bacchus's vine. And you're singing, so it's wine, women, and song. You get the idea. And we know of at least one other person who knew the Anacreontic song. There was a fellow named Francis Scott Key, who wrote his own poem to be sung to the Anacreontic song. His poem begins, "Oh, say, can you see?" And it's sung to the tune that originally went, "To Anacreon in heaven as he sat in full glee." Well, his song goes, "Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?" So you might say that Mr. Francis Scott Key took a drinking song and turned it into America's national anthem, and that Beethoven took a drinking song and turned it into the world's national anthem, which in a sense it does. It is, with its universal message of what we used to say, the brotherhood of man, alle Menschen werden Brüder. But in today's inclusive world, I guess we have to say all persons should be siblings. Anyhow, if you were going to Vienna in 1824, you would approach the city across a big open space called the Glacis, no matter how you were approaching the city. And that space was left open on purpose, even if you were going straight towards the palace of the emperor here. That space is left open. And here you can see that space. This is a map printed in London in 1824. And if you decided to skip the end of your junior year at Harvard and take the boat and pass by London on your way to the concert, you could have bought this map and taken it with you to Vienna, and across the bottom of the map are pictures of all of the sites you need to see. Anyhow, this is the old medieval part of the city sits in the middle. The Glacis is around it, a big open space. The Danube flows along the top, the beautiful blue Danube, and then out in a ring on the outside is what they call the suburbs, with a further set of walls out here, which are really sort of toll gates. The reason for the open space is that it means that nobody can get, that it's wider than the throw of a 17th century cannon. You can't get an artillery piece within shooting distance of the central city without its being out in the open. And you can see that the medieval bastions, the arrowhead-shaped bastions of the medieval fortifications are still there. They've now been replaced by a series of boulevards called the Ringstraßen. And those of you who've been to Vienna will know, people will say, oh, are you staying inside the ring? They're not talking about Wagner operas. They're talking about that series of boulevards that replaced the walls. In fact, you probably know that the French word boulevard is the same word as bulwark. A boulevard is what replaces a bulwark when those kinds of medieval fortifications are no longer necessary. So you can also see at the bottom of the inner city the sort of triangular shape of the footprint of the palace of the emperors of Austria, kings of Hungary and Poland. It's a great big international city full of all sorts of colonialism, full of repressive government, full of secret police and spies. You can also see, maybe make out in the very center of the city, looking kind of like a spider in her web, the footprint of St. Stephen's Cathedral, the big Catholic cathedral. This is a Catholic country, and the cathedral is at the center. You can see the tower, the Steffel, the tower of St. Stephen's Cathedral from almost anywhere in the city. This is the view that Mozart had when he put his head out his window instead of composing the Marriage of Figaro, which is what he was supposed to be doing while he lived in this apartment. But anywhere in the city, here's the cathedral. And those of you who've been to Vienna will know that it looks pretty much like that now, except that including the characteristic two-horse, four-wheel fiacre over here. Nowadays, there's usually a line of these carriages waiting to take tourists around the city, except they now have rubber automobile tires on them to be quiet over the cobblestones. And there's now a subway entrance where this lady over here on the left is standing, but otherwise, not much different. Here's the Mailmarkt. the grain market, one of the big public squares. Over on the right is a coffee house where Mozart used to take his coffee. This is a picture, maybe you can tell, painted a number of years before our performance. You can tell it probably by these two gentlemen casting a shadow in the lower middle of the picture because of the way their three-cornered hats and their knee breeches. This picture was painted in the latter part of the 18th century, and a lot has happened since then. If you think about it, one of the things that's happened since the picture was painted is the French Revolution, which is a little bit scary to well, the first thing, I guess, is the American Revolution in the 1770s. That doesn't make any European potentates happy when people under their own steam decide that they will no longer obey the authority, the God-given authority of the king or the emperor. And then nearer at hand is the French Revolution, where not only do they disregard the king's orders, but they chop his head off. That's a little disturbing. Then along comes Napoleon Bonaparte, who overruns all of Europe, including Austria, including Vienna. And it's after the defeat of Napoleon that the powers of Europe gather in Vienna at what's called the Congress of Vienna in 1815 to decide on the boundaries of post-Napoleonic Europe. And they say that it's at the Congress of Vienna, for which actually Beethoven composed a cantata. They say it's at the Congress of Vienna that gentlemen first appeared in public with long trousers of the kind we all used to wear before the COVID lockdown, the kind of trousers that go all the way down to the tops of your shoes. So you can see that these guys standing out here are not Congress of Vienna period people. A lot has changed, and Beethoven has lived through it all. He writes a symphony. And he writes a symphony for people who live in Vienna and who know how a symphony is supposed to go. And everybody knows how a symphony is supposed to go. First of all, you have a big, long first movement. It's supposed to start loud and fast, because you put a symphony first in a program before you come to the serious stuff to call the audience to attention. And if it's not loud and fast, the audience won't notice you've started. So a symphony should start loud and fast. And then comes a beautiful slow movement, then comes a minuet, and then comes an up-tempo final fourth movement. Fine. So he writes this symphony, and yes, it begins as a first movement, but it begins not at all the way a symphony is supposed to begin. This symphony begins, and it tells you right from the beginning, this is going to be cosmic, and it is going to be long. Don't be in a hurry with this symphony, it says. And in fact, Beethoven gives us a kind of composing lesson at the very beginning of the symphony. It begins, as I'm sure you remember, with a kind of a cosmic background noise. You don't know whether it started or not for sure. You just hear a kind of a sound. Do you or do you not hear a sound? It isn't fast. It isn't slow. It isn't major. It isn't minor. It gives you almost zero information except this background. And then out of that almost non-existent background comes the world's smallest possible event. Ba-dum. That's one piece of information, that's all. And then you hear that again, ba-dum. And a third time, ba-dum. And then those little sparks happen again, but they happen closer together in time. Ba-dum. Ba-dum. Then it gets a little bit longer. It becomes a three-note event, ba-ba-dum, ba-ba-dum, and so on. And these little specks of light float together until finally they assemble a theme. He shows you how to compose, and he also lets you know a lot about the general nature of this symphony. There. They're closer together. Three notes. Okay, now we're up and running, which is fine. That's how the symphony begins, as I'm sure we all remember. One of the another big difference between Beethoven's Vienna and now is that we have a sort of a different approach to symphonies from the way his audience did. here in Boston, and maybe in the city where you live, at least in a lot of places all around the world, we have a wonderful institution called the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They have a fixed personnel. They rehearse together all the time. And before this terrible time and after this terrible time, they give a regular series of symphony concerts in a beautiful purpose-built concert hall called Symphony Hall. And actually, over the stage of Symphony Hall in Boston is a cartouche that has one word in it. That word is Beethoven. Beethoven's symphonies are at the center of the symphonic repertory, and most places have a standing symphony orchestra that plays a regular series of symphonic concerts in a purpose-built concert hall. Well, in Beethoven's Vienna, where these symphonies that are at the core of our classical music life had their origin, there was no symphony orchestra, no regular series of symphony concerts, and no symphonic concert hall. Isn't that weird? It seemed, and yet they kept on writing these pieces. Well, so what it means is, if you're going to perform your symphony, you have to give a concert that's called an academy. They didn't call them concerts because the word concert in German is already in use for what we call a concerto. It's called an academy. And if you're going to give an academy, you got to compose the music, cause it to be printed, print the tickets, sell the tickets, and find a place to do it, and find an orchestra and figure out a way to get them to play, and so on. Got to go through the whole thing. So one of Beethoven's first jobs is figuring out where to give this concert in May of 1824. So the places you would consider include these: the big ballroom in the Imperial Palace. Here it's set up for an operatic performance under Maria Theresia, but that's one of the big spaces that people sometimes hired to give concerts. You might hire the indoor riding ring attached to the Imperial Palace. Here they're having what they call a carousel, but this is a carousel for carriages rather than just horses. We use the word carousel, you know, it's named for the Place du Carrousel in front of the Louvre in Paris. Carousel is a word we use for horses moving in patterns to music, cavalry displays. And we still use the word carousel for horses moving to patterns in music, except our horses tend to be wooden and go around in a circle. Anyhow, this is one of the possibilities. Another possibility is the Burgtheater, the court theater, the theater. It's the building here with the dome on top. No, the dome on the top is the indoor riding ring, where you can still go and see the famous Le Pizza Stallions. The building on the right with the arched windows is the Burgtheater, the palace theater. In 1824, it was being used for stage plays, but it had been used for operas. Here, it looks like they're giving a very boring play. I mean, there are not many people there, and they're not paying attention. It looks like even the actor who's giving a speech at the foot of that statue is bored. Maybe you can tell that the orchestra was there. You can see the scrolls of the double basses, but they played an overture. They're out having a couple of beers, and they'll be back to play an entr'acte. And you can see that the floor, there are lots of boxes, but the floor is divided, like most Viennese theaters, into business class and economy. This is one of the places Beethoven considered, but the place he really wanted to use was this theater. This is called the Theater an der Wien, the theater built along the little stream called the Wien or Wieden that flows into the Danube. This is a place where Beethoven had actually lived in an apartment in the building earlier in his career, and he loved this theater. It's the place where he had premiered his only opera, Fidelio, and it's the building that was built with the proceeds from Mozart's Magic Flute. That is, it was built by Mr. Schikaneder, who had commissioned the Magic Flute from Mozart and who played the role of Papageno, who plays the little panpipes in the Magic Flute. Mozart never lived to see this theater completed, but I think of it as being Mozart's theater as much as anybody else's. It was very large and designed to have all the kind of magic effects that are called for in Mozart's Magic Flute and a lot of other operas of the time, with people coming down from the ceiling, the Queen of the Night appearing on the moon. You can have horses on stage, you can have fountains on stage, all sorts of things. And this is what Beethoven wanted. The theater is still there, even though it has its 19th century facade. And when I went by and took this picture, as you can see, they were playing the Phantom of the Opera. And they thought I was going to think of Andrew Lloyd Webber. But of course, the phantoms I was thinking of were Beethoven's Fidelio and Mozart's Magic Flute. Anyhow, despite his fondness for the place, Beethoven couldn't come to terms with them because they wanted him to use their orchestra, their conductor, their singers. All he said, well, actually, I have some of my own people in mind, and they couldn't work it out. So he didn't. He didn't use this place. The venue he decided on was this here. This is the theater that was being used as the Opera House at the time. Its official name is the Royal Imperial Court Theater next to the gate that leads to the province of Carinthia. That's actually its name. And here is it's built near this is the old medieval wall of the city. And right down here is the gate that leads to Carinthia at the bottom of the Kärntnerstrasse. And this is the Opera House, the Kärntnertortheater. And it's large, as opera houses very often are, as you see, with boxes all stacked up, two classes of seat on the floor. And it's in this theater on the 24th of May, on the 7th of May, 1824, that Beethoven gave his academy that included his new symphony, the Ninth Symphony, in this space here. You have to do everything, not just compose the music, but you have to cause there to be music for people to play and sing from. There was the orchestra of the theater whom he engaged, but he had to double the size of the orchestra, so he recruited a lot of amateurs from a Friends of Music Association. There was a chorus in the theater, but he had to double it, at least double. It might have been bigger than that, with a bunch of amateurs. So it was an orchestra and a chorus that had never performed together before. This is one of Beethoven's original performing parts for the Ninth Symphony. Several performing parts still survive in Vienna. I wish we had them all, because then we'd know more specific details about the size of the orchestra. We have a pretty good idea, though. This is music written by a professional copyist, but with corrections in Beethoven's hand. There was a lot to do: print up tickets, print up posters. Here's a poster. Here's one of the posters for this concert, and I'm sure your German is at least as good as mine, so you can read it. It says, "A Grand Musical Academy by Herr Ludwig von Beethoven, which tomorrow, the 7th of May, 1824, in the Royal Imperial Court Theater next to the Carinthia Gate," I told you that was the name, "will be given. Die dabei vorkommenden Musikstücke sind die neuesten Werke." The pieces of music to be performed are the latest works of Herr Ludwig von Beethoven. Well, there's a little bit of media hype in that. They're not all of his most recent works, but he knew about salesmanship. And that's another interesting difference between them and us, because Beethoven's audience would far rather go hear new music than old music. I'll bet you, though, that if most modern concert goers, if I go up to you and say, I have 2 tickets to the Brahms Requiem in this hand, and I have 2 tickets to Louise Stiggins's new Requiem in this hand, which pair do you want? Most people will pick the tickets to something that they already know and like. Well, in Beethoven's day, if you advertise it as new, they will come. That's interesting. And I think it has to do with the fact that most music given in those days was in a style that people recognized. So it's like reading a new Agatha Christie or seeing a new episode of Suits or something. It's another version of something that you already know how it goes, but you want to see a new one. Anyhow, he claims it's all the latest new works. And here's the program. First, a grand overture. Well, this is not his latest work. This is a recent piece that he'd written for the rededication of a suburban theater in Vienna, what we now call the Consecration of the House Overture. Second, 3 grand hymns with solo and chorus voices. Well, this is a result of a lot of negotiation with the censors. What this is most of what we now call the Missa Solemnis, Beethoven's titanic choral and orchestral work, using the words of the Catholic Mass. And the censor said, no, 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 1,000 times no. We are an upstanding Catholic country. We do not perform masses in theaters for money. No, no, no. You may be famous, Mr. Beethoven. No. And there's a lot of back and forth with the censors trying to get this thing through. And they finally agreed that if he said grand hymns and didn't say anything about mass, he could get away with it. So that's what that is. Most of them is a solemnis. Third, a grand symphony within the finale entering solo and choral voices on Schiller's song To Joy. That's us, that's our symphony. And then it goes on to say the solo voices will be Mademoiselle Sonntag and Unger and Herr Heitzinger and Zeipelt and Mr. Who other people. And Mr. Ludwig van Beethoven himself will take part in the leadership of the whole. That's another media thing. They wanted to see Beethoven. He is by now, of course, far too deaf to be able to lead a concert successfully because he can't tell whether he's together with them or what's going on. But he stood on the stage and indicated tempos to the conductor, Mr. Umlauf, and that was probably, certainly, an attraction to the audience. The singers are worth a whole 2 or 3 lectures all in themselves, and we don't have time to spend a lot of time on them. But we might say that Henrietta Sonntag, the soprano soloist who sang all of that Missa Solemnis and the Ninth Symphony, was 18 years old and already had a really worldwide operatic career. And she went on to have a much longer one. She was famous in New York for smoking cigars when she toured North America. She's a really interesting person, and so is the Carolina Unger, who is the person who turned Beethoven around during the concert so that he could see people clapping. Anyway, that's how that works. And there's all sorts of things you have to do. One of the things you have to do is something that I'm going to do pretty soon, I hope, is get a haircut. Here's a drawing of Beethoven made in May of 1824. And I'm not sure of this, but I think that this may show Beethoven's concert haircut. I don't know if it matters, but it matters to me. The fact is that after the concert, Beethoven went to dinner in the Augarten with his nephew Karl and his very good friend Ignaz Schuppanzig. Schuppanzig was the very portly, very famous violinist who had recently come back from Russia. And he was back in Vienna, and he served as the concertmaster for Beethoven's concert. They were old friends, and Beethoven always referred to Schuppanzig as my Lord Falstaff. Not sure why, but probably partly because of Schuppanzig's size, and maybe also because of his potatory prowess. Anyhow, they're at dinner in the Augarten after the concert, and Beethoven's nephew Karl writes in his conversation book. You know, it's very sad that Beethoven is so deaf that he has to carry on his conversations in books. It's very sad for Beethoven, but very lucky for us because we have access to a lot of intimate details of Beethoven's life that we wouldn't otherwise know about. Anyhow, Karl writes in Beethoven's conversation book, my Lord Falstaff praises the master who cut your hair. Now, I don't know, this drawing may show Beethoven's concert haircut. Doesn't matter to the sound of the Ninth Symphony, I think, but it matters to me to think that even Beethoven has got to get a haircut and take his jacket to the cleaners and buy salami on the way home from rehearsal and things like that. So here's this symphony. We all know how this symphony goes, but let me just remind you a little bit of what comes next after that beautiful first movement. As you know, a symphony should have a weighty first movement and then a beautiful lyrical slow movement and then a dance movement. Well, Beethoven swaps the two interior movements and puts the dance movement second. But instead of having the traditional minuet the way Mozart and Haydn used to do, Beethoven, for the last several symphonies, has had a kind of a minuet on speed. It's a speeded up minuet that he calls a scherzo, Italian for joke. Instead of going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, it goes 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. It's sort of crazy. And everybody knows this scherzo, I think. Probably nobody in this audience is old enough to remember the Huntley-Brinkley report, but you will know. Here's the beginning of the scherzo with that wonderful fake out from the kettle drums. It's a little fugue. And then after that comes the very, very beautiful slow movement. A lot of people, I think of the slow movement as being a little bit like New Jersey. By that, I mean that New Jersey is what keeps you from getting to Philadelphia faster. And most people are waiting for the last movement and to hear the tune, and they get sort of impatient with the slow movement. But don't get impatient with the slow movement. It's so beautiful. It's a sort of a series of alternating variations on two beautiful themes. It begins with a kind of a halo in the woodwinds, and then the strings play the first phrase of the beautiful first theme. And at the end of that first phrase is echoed by the woodwinds. And then the strings play the second phrase and the woodwinds echo, and so on. And it goes on for quite a lot longer than that. But here's how the slow movement begins. There's the woodwinds. First phrase. An echo from the winds, and onward and onward. And then comes the most god-awful train wreck anybody ever heard, namely the beginning of the last movement. What on earth is going on? A huge discord. Sounds like kind of an explosion of some kind. And then nothing but cellos and double basses. Well, Beethoven's audience, hearing that beginning of the last movement, will have looked at each other and nodded their heads and said, yeah, I know what that is. That's a bass rage recitative. And I'm sure we all agree that's just what it sounds like, a bass rage recitative, right? Well, just in case that doesn't mean anything to you or you need your memory refreshed, let me refresh your memory. There's the one kind of music that probably everybody in Beethoven's audience knew and was regularly available in Vienna was opera. And in the opera, what happens in an opera is you have recitatives where people talk, usually to the accompaniment of a harpsichord. They're actually singing, but in kind of speaking rhythm. And then every now and then you stop and you have a song called an aria. So, for example, you might have an opera about Julius Caesar, and the curtain opens and there's a chorus that says, "Welcome to Egypt, Mr. Caesar." And then the harpsichord plays, and a soldier runs on the stage and said, "Bad news, Caesar, the Egyptian army has reformed and even now is marching this way." He says, "Call my army. We beat them once, we'll beat them again." And then the orchestra starts playing really loud, warlike music. Caesar steps down stage and says, to arms, we fight the Egyptians," sings a beautiful song. We all clap. He goes off stage to lead his army. Then they all put down their violins. The harpsichord plays, and a beautiful woman, Mrs. Caesar, says, "Scarcely have I come to this foreign country when my beloved goes off to war. I don't know whether he'll ever come back. I shall hide myself in some deep place, cave, until he return." Then the orchestra starts playing really, really, really sad music. She comes down stage and sings a beautiful lamenting song about how sad she is. She goes off to hide herself. We clap, and so on. That's how operas work. An alternation of talking, kind of the movie, what advances the plot, and arias, which are freeze frames, whose purpose is to explore how a person feels in a particular situation, explore emotion in music. And the plot is not designed to be realistic. It's just designed to get the characters from one situation to another where they can discuss how they feel. So that's how that works, except that every now and then, the situation doesn't call for a recitative and it doesn't call for an aria, which explores one kind of emotion. Sometimes somebody feels a quick succession of passionate emotions. And in those cases, composers tend to reserve a specific kind of thing called an accompanied recitative, and that means you speak in sort of reciting rhythm, but you're not accompanied by the harpsichord. You're accompanied by the whole orchestra, and those things are saved for moments of very high passion. So my favorite accompanied recitative is from a little opera by Handel that Beethoven knew. He'd heard it performed, and Mozart had made a version of it for Vienna, a little opera called Acis and Galatea. And if you think my Egyptian plot was stupid, there's nothing more stupid than Acis and Galatea. It's about the handsome shepherd Acis who falls in love with the divine nymph Galatea. And when the curtain opens, Acis comes on and says, "I'm looking for Galatea. Does anybody know where Galatea is?" And then he sings a beautiful song about where shall I seek the charming fair. Then he goes off to look for Galatea. She comes on and sings a song saying, where is Acis? And then she sings, she says a recitative, beautiful song about hush, ye pretty warbling choir, bring back my Acis to my sight. They alternate arias, each looking for the other, until at the end of the first half, they happen to come on stage at the same time. They sing a beautiful duet called Happy, Happy We, and that's the end of the first half. Pretty dumb, but it has fantastic music. And at the beginning of the second half, they trot out the plot in the form of the evil giant Polyphemus. Now, the problem is that Polyphemus is also in love with Galatea. That's the problem. They sing a beautiful trio. Polyphemus smashes Acis flat with a rock. Everybody's very sad. And then finally, Galatea decides to turn Acis into a bubbling fountain that will flow through all eternity. She says, "Be thou immortal if thou be not mine." And there's a beautiful final chorus about the fountain, and that's the end. Well, this is the place where Polyphemus appears for the first time. And he says, "I rage." And then he says, his next words are, "I melt." And his next words are, "I burn." So it's quick changes of emotion. He's in a rage because he's jealous. He melts because he's in love, and he burns with hatred of Acis. And then he explains why. He says, "The feeble god has stabbed me to the heart." That is, little Cupid has wounded great big me. And then, because the role of Polyphemus is being played by a normal human being and not by a 10-foot tall giant with one eye in the middle of his forehead, he has to explain that he's a giant. So he says, "I use a whole pine tree as my walking stick. Thou trusty pine, prop of my godlike steps, I lay thee by." And then he says, "Bring me 100 great big reeds to make a panpipe from my great big mouth," not one of those little Papageno jobs, but a giant one, because I'm so big, "so that I can sing the praises of the beautiful Galatea." The point of all of this is that you can switch from one mood to another quickly while the orchestra accompanies this recitative. And here's the statue of Polyphemus looking down on Acis and Galatea in the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris. And here's what he has to say. But also, and
the feeble god has stabbed me to the heart. Thou trusty pine, prop of my godlike steps, I lay thee by. Bring me 100 reeds of decent growth to make a pipe for my capacious love. In soft enchanting accents, let me breathe sweet Galatea's beauty and my love.
Then he goes to sing about how beautiful she is. She's just like a baby goat. A wonderful piece, Acis and Galatea. Well, if you're going to have quick changes of emotion, there's nothing like an accompanied recitative. And if it's somebody in a rage, it's always a bass. Maybe you know the one in Handel's Messiah that goes, brum, 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 thus saith the Lord of hosts, there once a little while and I will shout. Well, that's a bass rage recitative, and so is this. I rage. What's this? That's the beginning of the first movement. You can't do that in a symphony. You can't put the first movement in the last movement. What's he doing? Oh, no, they say. Oops, that's the scherzo. Oh. Oh, there's that beautiful theme from the slow movement. They say, no, no. No, I have this yearning. Well, how about something like, oh, yes. I have a classic recitative ending here. And then we have the aria. You hear the people singing, playing the tune. The orchestra plays the tune, more and more and more and more variations on the tune, getting louder and louder. And then, just in case somebody had wandered in from the Turkish army and didn't know what a bass rage recitative is, once they finish the variations on the tune, the whole thing happens again, and a bass stands up and says what the double basses have already said one time, namely, not those sounds, friends, but let us have songs of joy. And we'll let him go on a little bit, and you be sure you mute yourselves, and then in the privacy of your own home, you can sing along with him.
Nicht diese Töne, sondern lasst uns angenehmere anstimmen und freudenvollere. Freude, Freude, schöne Götterfunken poppen aus Elysium. Wir betreten feuertrunken, himmlische dein Heiligtum. Deine Zauber binden wieder, was die Mode streng geteilt. Alle Menschen werden brüten, wo dein sanfter Flügel war.
Well, there was never a message more important that all humankind should be brethren. I'm for that. I think Beethoven would probably be pleased to know that his message from then is still resonating with us now. But I think it's also true that when we compare the situation that obtained in Vienna in 1824 and that obtains in our own world, we learn an awful lot about what music meant to that audience and what it means to us. We learned a lot about them, but even more important, maybe, we learn a lot about ourselves. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I wish Beethoven a happy 250th birthday, which will come in December of this year. And in another couple of years, the 150th birthday of this beautiful Ninth Symphony. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you so much, Tom. This was just absolutely delightful and so entertaining. Thank you. I'd like to transition to the Q&A portion of our program. We have received many pre-submitted questions in addition to the live questions coming in, so we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. I'd like to start with this question posed by many of our viewers today, and you did touch upon this, Tom. I wonder how Beethoven completed the Ninth Symphony despite his hearing difficulties. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, go on it. For one thing, a lot of people have said Beethoven wouldn't have done what he did if he could hear better, and people have corrected Beethoven's orchestration from time to time. That's a long discussion, but I think Beethoven knew exactly what he was doing. Let me ask you a question, everybody. Have you ever found yourself singing or whistling something in the afternoon that you don't know why? And if you think about it, you realize it's actually something you heard on the radio earlier in the morning. And usually you're actually whistling it in the same key that you heard it on the radio. What I want to know is, where has that music been between when you heard it at 8 o'clock in the morning and when you whistled it to yourself without remembering where it came from at 4 in the afternoon? Well, if we can do that, think what Beethoven can do with his oral memory. He had a lifetime of experience writing for orchestras, testing things out. And he, although he did a lot of his composing in his head, although he did play some things at the piano, I think he's perfectly competent to do that. I think he knew exactly what he was doing, exactly what he wanted, and exactly what it was going to sound like. I'll never be able to prove it, but I really believe that.
Great, thank you. To our next question, what was Beethoven's reaction to the first performance? What was Vienna's reaction? And might I also add the audience reaction?
Okay, well, Beethoven's reaction was pretty negative. Not that it was a bad performance. It probably was a bad performance, but it was actually the best performance the Ninth Symphony had ever had in its whole career, because it was the only performance it had ever had. He at that same dinner where he got praised for his haircut, he accused his nephew and his friend of cheating him at the box office. There was not as much rehearsal as he wished they had. He was not completely satisfied, but I think he was glad that the concert came off and they got to the end of everything without any train wrecks, without anything falling apart. So it was pretty good. Vienna's reaction, well, one of the things about the Ninth Symphony is we are just in the beginning of the period of musical journalism. We actually have articles in musical newspapers and others describing this concert. A few years earlier, we would have no information about Beethoven's academies, or very little. What we do know is that the critics were admiring of Beethoven. He was a famous composer and a jewel in the crown of Vienna. They said nice things about him, nice things about his symphony, and they said things that suggest very gently that it wasn't the greatest performance that anything ever had. They said things like, the winds did very bravely, or some of the strings couldn't keep up with sort of the hard parts and that kind of thing. So it does look as though in this put together at the last minute orchestra that they apparently only had 2 rehearsals with everybody for the whole concert. Now, I know the Boston Symphony Orchestra can play the Ninth Symphony on the strength of 2 rehearsals without any difficulty, but they know it and they've played it a million times. And if you're somebody who usually plays in the opera pits and you go boom, 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 most of your time, your part for the Ninth Symphony is a very different kind of thing. So although the press were complimentary, they were actually essentially complimenting the music in Beethoven and not so much its performance.
Thank you. Well, this is a great next question. Did Beethoven have rivals during this time, or were his contemporaries supportive of him?
Well, yes, both. He had the main rival of anybody alive in the 1820s was a guy named Rossini. Beethoven absolutely hated Rossini, but I think he hated Rossini mostly because Rossini was wildly popular all over Europe. Everybody wanted to play Rossini and nothing but Rossini in the opera houses. People wrote music imitating Rossini so that they could get famous. Now, Schubert wrote music that sounds like Rossini. Even Beethoven wrote some music that sounds like Rossini. He claims he hated him. I think he was enormously jealous. It's true that Beethoven never, I think, thought of himself as an opera composer. He wrote one very beautiful opera, but it's not sort of standard operatic fare. And I think Beethoven knew that he and Rossini were on different paths. Rossini was somebody who was doing, I don't want to say heart on your sleeve, but easy to listen to, really beautiful music that you can hear the first time and get everything. And he can do a lot of it as fast as he wants to. And Beethoven is doing music for the ages that requires a kind of perfection and a kind of self-centering that Rossini never had and never wanted. So they're sort of opposite poles coexisting at the same time.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's interesting. So let's see to our next question here. Was Beethoven the first to place a choral movement in a symphony? Were there precedents? And why did he add it in the finale?
Okay. There might be symphonies that had chorus, but I don't know. Not any symphonies in our standard repertory have chorus in them until Beethoven. Then everybody does it after that. But the thing is, this is not the first time Beethoven has done this in a way, since in an earlier concert where he premiered his fifth and sixth symphonies, he wrote a piece that we now call the choral fantasy. He wrote a piece to go at the end of that concert, specifically to go for that concert, that would include all the people in the show. The choral fantasy begins with somebody, Beethoven as it happens, playing wonderful stuff on the piano. Then comes the orchestra and they play variations on something that sounds a little bit like a folk song. In fact, it sounds kind of like the tune in the Ninth Symphony. And then come four vocal solos and a chorus who do more variations on that song, so that it has orchestra and chorus, actually has piano in that piece. The choral fantasy, it's a separate piece, but it includes everybody in the concert. And I think that one of the reasons for having the chorus there, maybe he always conceived the symphony as having a chorus at the end, but it also has the effect of putting everybody on stage together the way you like to do at the end of a show. You'd like to have a big number at the end of your musical or whatever it is, where everybody is there singing and dancing and getting applause. So the precedent for this exists, but it's not a symphony, it's the choral fantasy.
Thank you. This next question I see, did Beethoven mentor any well-known composers?
He had a few students. There were some people who worked with him, but no, not really. He was kind of a loner. And although other people, including Mozart and Haydn, had made all sorts of efforts to put together life as a musician by doing all the different kinds of things you need to do, teach lessons and teach well-to-do ladies how to play the piano, work for Prince Esterhazy. Beethoven was really kind of his own guy. He was a kind of a romantic artist in a way, and he knew what he wanted to do. And even though he had made efforts to get along with his aristocratic patrons earlier in his life, he'd really done better by insulting them all. And they loved him for it in a way, and he got a lot of support from people whom he insulted and did not serve very well. So he was kind of an independent spirit, and he made most of his money by selling his music to publishers and by getting presents from. It was customary to dedicate your work to some grand person, and that person would then send you a gold snuff box full of coins or something like that. And he often sold his music, the Ninth Symphony, for example, he sold to two different publishers. Neither knew that the other one, each one thought they had exclusive rights to publish the Ninth Symphony. That's Beethoven for you.
Thank you. That was very interesting. Let's get to our next question. Why does it seem that 9 symphonies is the total number of symphonies by well-known composers? Is there something to this?
I think there is something, maybe not in every case, but that people begin to think there's a kind of a hex on going beyond 9 symphonies. Mahler's has 9 symphonies, and Bruckner decided it would be kind of tempting fate to write something else. So Bruckner, instead of writing a 10th symphony, wrote a 0 symphony. He wrote a symphony number 0, just to make sure he didn't exceed the number 9. The fact is, though, that there's nothing mystical about it in Beethoven's head. He had sketches for his next symphony. He didn't sit down. Nobody sits down to write his last symphony, you know. And wouldn't it be interesting to know what Beethoven's 10th symphony was going to be like?
Mm-hmm.
I bet it would have been a little lighthearted, fluffy piece.
So let's see. We've got a few more minutes here. Where did Beethoven's ability to compose come from? Do we know anything about his background or family life?
If I knew where it came from, I would go and get it myself. I'm not sure it comes from places that you can get it. But Beethoven's father was a double bass player. Beethoven was raised to be a musician. And he studied with Haydn a little bit, although he wasn't completely happy with the lessons he had with Haydn. So he had musical training, and he was a virtuoso keyboard player. He started off showing off as a piano player, and only later did his reputation sort of change into being that of a great composer. But the talent, I don't know. Where do those things come from? There is the 4,000 hours of practice or whatever it is.
Right.
That's not for composing. That's for playing the piano or playing the violin or something. So I think there's something innate there that I wish I had, and I'm sure I don't.
Mm-hmm. I think we all do. So let's end on this last question, Tom. What are some of the differences that one might hear across different recordings of this piece?
Well, interesting. The recordings that you all heard, and I'm sorry Zoom doesn't permit better sound, was a recording that I've used for a long time with my students that uses instruments of Beethoven's period. So the strings are all strung with gut strings. The woodwinds are slightly different. The horns are natural horns without any valves. The trumpets are natural trumpets, and they have a slightly mellower sound. And that's a sound you might recognize with really good amplification, with really good sound system, or in a hall where that difference was being distinguished. Also, one of the things that I liked about the recording I used, which is a recording directed by Roger Norrington quite some years ago now, is that Norrington makes an effort to observe Beethoven's metronome marks. We have metronome marks for how all the different sections of this symphony ought to go in Beethoven's hand. People disregard them all the time, but as far as I'm concerned, you disregard them at your peril. And Norrington does not do that. I was raised on an old Toscanini recording where the scherzo goes a lot slower than that, and where the Turkish march in the last movement goes like 10 times faster than Norrington takes it. That's how I thought it. We usually think the music is supposed to go at the rate of the recording we know best. So this is the one I'm used to. So that's the one I like.
Thank you. Excellent. Tom, thank you so much. On behalf of the Harvard Travel team and our alumni community, I'd like to thank you for the fabulous music that you have shared with us and this lively and engaging conversation. As a reminder for our viewers, you will receive a recording of this lecture via email. As soon as you close out of the webinar, a brief survey will appear. We'd be grateful if you take the time to complete this survey so we can better serve you. For those of you interested in traveling with Tom, I invite you to check out his next Harvard travel trip, Cruising the Danube River, this October. Please find more details in your chat. Finally, we hope you'll join us for our next travel-inspired webinar, Cuba in Focus, featuring faculty speakers from Brown, Harvard, and Tufts. Thank you again, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.